Hi, I'm Dan, and this is my virtual pinball machine. It's a cabinet I built myself, and I'd like to show you around. But first, it is kind of boring. That is until we turn it on. No, wait. I'm going to show you a real pinball machine first. This is Funhouse. It was made by Williams Electronics in 1990, and this particular one is from my personal collection. It's a really fun machine to play, and I like it a lot, so let's take a look. So this is the back box of the pinball machine. It's really where the brain of the pinball machine is in modern pinball machines. And it opens up this way. Alright, so here is the way it opens up. And inside here, there's a large number of components in a machine in this era anyway. Newer machines are a lot more simplified than this. Here's where a lot of the power is generated for the various components, all the solenoids, the flippers, the pop bumpers and so forth. It's all generated and controlled through here. Over here is the actual computer that controls the main functions of the machine. And up here is where the sound is generated for the speaker that comes out of the speakers. Alright, so the pinball machine opens up with a simple key at the bottom here. And then we have what's called the lockdown bar. That comes out. And then it's a good idea to close this back up so that it doesn't interfere with the glass sliding down. The glass just slides right out. Set that aside carefully. And now the playfield lifts up. One thing it's a good idea to do is to eject the balls so that they don't suddenly come pouring down on you. This particular machine uses 3 balls. Many machines use more than that. Older machines only use a single ball. So now that we've got this up here, you can see some of the things that make up a typical pinball machine. So this is what the underside of the pinball machine looks like. Most modern machines have some version of this. They'll have different configuration, of course, depending on what's there. One thing that they have in common to start with, this is where the balls collect, and they normally rest before they're put into play. There is, next to that, 2 flippers. These are the solenoids that control flippers. When you press the button on the cabinet, this makes the electronics kick in and pull this mechanically here, and the flipper moves the ball. Then we have some light bulb sockets. These really just unscrew and have little light bulbs inside them. Over here, this particular machine is a clock theme, and so this is the clock display, all the light bulbs that involve that. And right here, this is an up kicker. So what happens is that the ball will go through one of these two holes here, travel down this clear plastic subway, they're sometimes called, and come over here where it's then kicked out back onto the playfield at the top. Up here is the upper flipper on the left side. And then, probably the most important thing of all, this is Rudy's jaw. Rudy is the dummy that lives in this game and is the central feature. And this is what moves his mouth up and down, this gearbox right here.
So here you see the emulated pinball machine in action. We can talk a little bit about the differences. First of all, on the minus side, it's 3D, but obviously not quite the same. Secondly, sometimes the physics aren't quite realistic. This can vary depending on the emulator. And in some cases, the emulators actually make this intentional because they want to make the game a little more exciting. And finally, there can sometimes be a little bit of lag, so the difference between the time when you push the button and the flipper actually makes contact with the ball might not really seem quite right compared to what a seasoned pinball machine player experiences. So things might not seem quite exactly the same. On the plus side, you can play hundreds of different machines that would otherwise be difficult or even impossible or too expensive to find. Secondly, it's much easier and less expensive to repair a virtual pinball machine. Also, special effects can be added to a classic machine that was originally bland, so some people will add in special things that make the machine their own. And finally, entirely new machines can be created for no cost, just the time it takes to do it.
So overall, the pinball machine is the same size as a real pinball machine cabinet. The majority of the cabinet is made out of this, which is called medium density overlay, or MDO. Essentially, it's 3/4 inch plywood with a piece of paper permanently attached to both sides. And this is really the same kind of stuff that they use to make road signs. It's pretty cool stuff, and pretty durable too once you paint it up. There are also a couple of places where we also just use regular 1/8 inch masonite for the back of the cabinet and one place on the front. I used a table saw with both regular and dado blades, a router and drill press, and bar clamps to hold it together at various times. So it doesn't really require too many extended tools that you might not otherwise have if you have a home workshop. Overall, the pinball machine uses real legs as it would in an arcade machine. The side rails, which are the shiny part on the side, are also from a real pinball machine. The lockdown bar at the front and the hinges that hold the box in the back are also the same as you would find in a real machine. The glass is the same size as a real machine, and there's also a little bit of Lexan, which is a kind of plastic in front of the score display that you might find on some machines, but not usually. And finally, the coin door on the front is purely cosmetic. It's not actually functional. You didn't really need to be accepting quarters for people to play pinball. They do, however, sell real working ones if you wanted to get one. So the virtual pinball machine has 3 displays in it. The first one is a 42-inch TV. Initially, it had been a different 40-inch TV, an LCD TV, but I managed to break that one and had to replace it. So I actually just got a used one, lightly used, in really good shape, off of Craigslist. And what's kind of unique about the setup that I chose is that if you look down closely, you'll see that there's very little actual space between the edge of the display and the edge of the cabinet. Most of the time when people build these cabinets, they leave the TV in its original case. In order to prevent that, though, I actually took it out of the case. The advantage of that is, of course, it looks better, but the disadvantage is that it's a lot more fragile. as my misadventures point out. Next, we have the display for the score up here. I am using a 15-inch monitor, a very old one that was given to me. It turns out that an old LCD display is really just fine for this purpose. The monitor itself actually extends above and below what you see there. This is really just a small segment of it covered over with a bezel. And finally up at top here, we have another TV. This one I believe is a 27-inch if I remember correctly. And this is used to display the artwork for the pinball machine. All of these are handled by the Windows operating system, and so it's really just treated as one big desktop. Alright, so this is the audio system that's used. We've got two car stereo speakers, and they are driven by a regular old LabTech computer speaker amplifier, which lives up here inside the back box. And way down in the cabinet, we've got the subwoofer that comes with it as well. So we've got a little bit of bass in this cabinet too. Alright, so now that we've seen the outside of the machine, let's take a look inside. This is going to take a minute though, so let's fast forward. So this is what the virtual pinball cabinet looks like inside. What you're looking at right now is just a regular old PC. This particular one is running not a terribly up-to-date CPU, not a lot of RAM. It doesn't really need a lot. The important thing is that the graphics card really needs to have as many ports as you do displays. So you need three display ports on this particular graphics card. I'll tell you the specs at the end of what I use. However, if you don't want three displays, or if you don't mind a little bit of lag, or if you don't want displaying in 4K resolution, where you can probably get away with less expensive hardware, and very often you'll have some kicking around, especially if you've got been playing games over the years. Maybe your gaming machine from 3 or 4 years ago is going to be suitable. Alright, so inside the cabinet we have, at the heart of it, a Pinscape expansion board. This device is it's an open source project created by a very knowledgeable person who designed it to take the inputs from the cabinet switches, things like the flipper buttons and the buttons on the front, and translate them into signals, joystick presses that the software understands and knows to well, let's say move the flippers or do any of the functions of the pinball machine. The other thing that this first board does is it controls the plunger. So if you take a look over here, this device, which I have covered up currently, and this is a series of LEDs. I've just got them covered up so that they don't interfere with the picture. However, the plunger moves here, and as it does, it allows light to fire up into this board right here. And this is a little circuit board that contains a single row camera, and that camera then senses the position of the plunger, 1 pixel line at a time. When it does that, the software then translates that into motion on the screen, and it displays the plunger at a different position. The other thing that this first board does, if you look over here, is we have an actual plumb bob. This is the same kind of tilt bob that's used inside a real pinball machine to sense when somebody is shaking the machine too much. So this will give you a warning and say to not shake the machine so much, or it will also tilt the machine if you do it too much, depending on your game settings. So the other thing that this first board does is it has an accelerometer built into it, which also is what we use to know when the machine is being shaken. What it'll do is it'll translate that in the software into the emulation, and it will actually shake the ball around a tiny bit as well. And you can even control how much of an effect that has. So it's good for getting the more realistic effect of playing a real pinball machine, since everybody knows that nudging a machine is part of play. The next board that we've got is also from Pinscape, and this one is what controls the higher power outputs. So in this case, I'm using it to control lights. So if you zoom over here to this light switch, see that it's blinking right now. That's going through that second Pinscape board, and it's being powered by this regular old PC power supply right here. The other thing that happens with this is we've got solenoids. So when I push this flipper button over here, it makes this solenoid right here contact, which produces a sound that's more realistic than the normal sound effects that are part of the emulation. And finally, I have a row here of 3 different solenoids. These are 12-volt solenoids, and these produce various little sound effects. So for instance, when the slingshot is hit, that's down by the flipper on the left side, and this one would fire. On the right side, this other one fires. And if it's something that's happening in the middle of the playfield, this would happen. There's these 3 here, but there's also 3 more in the middle and 3 more toward the back. And by having them positionally situated, you sort of get a more realistic idea of where the sound is coming from, so it's a little more like a real pinball machine. The fortunate thing is, the software knows about all this stuff. You just tell it how many solenoids you have and how they're laid out, and the way that the games are written, they automatically know that if one of these pop bumpers up here is being triggered by the ball, it should fire a solenoid that's about in this area of the playfield. It's really cool that way. Now there are other things that you can have for your high power outputs. Some people do things like having a shaker motor that actually shakes the entire machine during certain games. There actually were certain games produced in the past that do this intentionally. One of them is called Earth Shaker, which is about an earthquake. And there's a few others as well. Some people do that. Other people will have things that they put on the top of the back box called toppers. So they would put a display up here that has other graphics that are specific to the game. Maybe some special lighting effects or something like that. There's another couple of games that have a fan that will blow at certain times of the game. And all those things can be controlled with the external board from the Pinscape. And the final thing that I sort of trigger off of that Pinscape board, the second one, is the knocker. And the knocker is that sound that you hear if you ever win a free game in a pinball machine, that really loud knocking noise. That's produced by another solenoid that lives inside the back box, up in the corner. And I actually put a real solenoid back there, just like in a real pinball machine, and so the sound is pretty much identical to what you would hear. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide this display back to its normal place, and I'm going to put back in this little filler block. What this does is it makes the machine look a little more finished. Otherwise, it's impossible to find a display that's the exact size of a pinball table, so this is kind of the best compromise I could come up with. It really doesn't look too bad in my opinion. Alright, so let's move the machine back and put the glass back on. Alright, so now let's talk about the software that runs this machine. So the most obvious thing is, of course, an operating system. We're using Windows. Personally, I would have rather used other things, but the software doesn't exist for anything but Windows, so we're kind of stuck with that. Next up, we've got what's called the front end. Now, front end is really just a way of choosing which game you want to play. In this particular case, I'm using one called Pinball X. It is free, and essentially lets you use the keyboard, the regular pinball flipper keys and select which game you want to play. And so the artwork all updates nicely when you switch between them, and then you just press the start button and the game launches, and when you're done you press the exit button and you're back out to where you were, and you can choose a new game to play. Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about the software that sort of runs things behind the scenes. First up is Visual Pinball. MAME itself is the multiple arcade machine emulator. It's been around for a long time, and what it does is it emulates traditionally video games. But because it's good at emulating all kinds of different computer hardware and electronic hardware that's been developed over many, many years, somebody came up with the bright idea of setting it to the task of emulating actual pinball machine code. So what it does is it emulates all the switch input and everything else and routes what you do with those joystick inputs coming from the switches and things on your cabinet, routes those into the actual firmware that ran on the original pinball machine. Some pinball machines don't use this because the game code is actually written by somebody to be specific to that game, but Visual Pinball lets you run all this old hardware on, emulate all this old hardware on a modern PC. And let's take a look at the display. That's really the other function that it does, is it shows you the display on the screen. In this case, a dot matrix display, but it also does regular old LED displays that display on that middle monitor in my case. Alright, so this is Visual Pinball. This is the software that I'm using to emulate the pinball machines and controls. It's kind of like the brains of everything in here. What it does is lets you edit the table and draw all the 3D primitives that make it up, all the ramps and the lights, and lets you control the textures that are displayed in the images and how all these parts interact with each other. And there's also a little bit of programming involved. If you want to, you can change options here. This is of course is one that I just downloaded and made some very minor changes to get it to work the way that I wanted it to. But of course, if you want to, you can create an entire pinball machine from scratch if you want, and control all the sound effects and lighting and everything else. And it's really actually a lot of fun to look at. This software interacts with Visual Pinball, as I said, but it also interacts with another piece of software called the Direct Output Framework, or DOF, D-O-F. What that does is that is what handles all the lighting effects. So every time the pinball machine realizes that a particular light should flash, it has the ability to have something that's on your cabinet flash instead. The same can also be said for the solenoids. All those sound effects that I have from the 9 solenoids running through the middle of the playfield, plus the 2 flippers and the knocker, those are all routed through DOF. And the games are actually pre-designed to work with that, many of the newest ones. And there are literally hundreds of machines. Some of them are these ones like Funhouse, which emulate a real existing machine, but also hundreds of ones that people have just created from scratch and are also very often very fun to play. There's another emulator out there too, which is completely separate from Visual Pinball that I've tried. It's called Future Pinball. And that one has only tables that are made from scratch. The effects in that game are actually quite good. I've just had a little bit of difficulty running it on my particular cabinet. I find that it doesn't necessarily work quite as well, but it actually has a very well-designed tutorial in how to set it up. Some of this stuff can be rather difficult to set up, but Future Pinball, the guy who has been working on the software for it lately, has done a fantastic job with some video tutorials for it. Now let's talk about the cost of pinball emulation. The cheapest way is absolutely free. You can set up Visual Pinball or other pinball emulators without creating a full-sized cabinet at all. Instead of flipper buttons and other switches, you just use a keyboard and a single regular computer monitor. It's a great way to try out emulation to see if you like it, or to see if your hardware is powerful enough to run the emulation. For this, just install the basics using the tutorial that can be found in the document that's available at the end of this video. Next up, you can do some specialized input hardware. That'll run you somewhere between $50 and $200 or $300. So what you do in this case is you keep using a regular monitor, but you add a special controller. This takes the place of a joystick when you're playing video games. I built one by taking apart an old keyboard, a regular PC keyboard, and wiring some arcade game switches to it. This was housed in a box that was the same width as an actual pinball machine. And I also, along the way, included 2 joysticks and some extra arcade switches and a rotary controller so I could play emulated video games using MAME as well. There are also some mass-produced consoles that do the same thing. Finally, you can go the full-out cabinet route like I did. So I was estimating that that would cost you somewhere between $1,600 to $2,900 altogether. Depends a lot, however, on what you want to put into it, and also what you have available already. So if you have like an old TV you can put in, you can save quite a bit of money by not buying something new. You might also have a copy of Windows you can throw onto the box and save a lot of money that way. Computer, motherboard, power supply, case, all those things you might have lying around already. And if you do, it's a big savings. So there actually is a price list that you can use as kind of a guide for estimating what it would cost to do the various things you might want to do. And that price list is included in the link that's at the end of this video. So you'll see that here. You can go to this page. It's a PDF document you can look at. And it also includes a QR code that you can scan here to get to it. And if you take a look at that, I think you'll find it helpful, and that's all I've got. So thanks for looking at the video, and I hope you enjoy emulating pinball.